How's it going, everybody? Well, at long last, we have come to the end of the Permian period. Our world has already gone through so many changes since we started with the fiery ball floating through the infant solar system. Despite the fact that we had just seen yet another die-off of several different species, leaving only around 1/3 of the terrestrial animals alive, we would see life continue to press on. And something that you may have noticed with each event that has resulted in a drop in biodiversity, every time it seems like the animals that make it through are just a little bit tougher for it. Not necessarily stronger, but better adapted to the changing world. But unfortunately, regardless of how enduring the plants and animals on this planet become, the Earth will always have the final say in who lives or dies. And as the continental plates continue to push into each other, tectonic forces were building to a tipping point that could have ramifications for every living being on Earth. But for the moment, we synapsids were still on top. Even though many genera like Dimetrodon and Adaphosaurus were gone, several others pushed on. And that's where we pick up, in the second half of the Permian period.
I have a bad feeling about this.
Picking up where things left off, tectonic activity was beginning to get more volatile. A string of microcontinents called Chimeria sheared away from the southern Gondwanan half of Pangea and started drifting north towards what would one day become Eurasia. This caused the Paleo-Tethis Sea to start to close, and the Neo-Tethis Sea on the other side to start to expand. This also pushed the chain of Chinese island continents northward on the same collision course. As this happened, the continental forces that had at this point been building since the two main continents had come together at the end of the Carboniferous would result in mountain ranges and volcanoes being pushed up all throughout the massive continent. Despite this all being one landmass, this was still made up of several continental plates, all of which were pushing together, which was the driving force behind all this activity. One place where this would happen is at the far western edge of Euramerica, pushing up mountains at the coast that in 260 million years would be known as the Guadalupe Mountains today. In the 21st century, this is a very small 105 kilometer or 65 mile long mountain range that is only around 2,600 meters tall at the Texas-New Mexico border. But during the Permian, this was a substantial mountain range, pushing up what was previously a part of an inland sea covered in a reef. This spelled doom for any of the marine animals that lived here at the time. But this would also preserve an excellent snapshot for paleontologists to find hundreds of millions of years later in the modern day. And this was just one example. This would become a reoccurring theme throughout the remainder of this period. The planet itself was becoming the most violent that it has been since the Archean, and every time that the Earth would roar to life, the local inhabitants wouldn't stand a chance. The other side effect of this was the interior of Pangea was becoming increasingly arid, for all the same reasons that we mentioned in the last video. When you put more mountains out there, it's going to block more rain from getting to more areas. It wasn't always hot all across Pangea. Many areas had similar conditions to Central Asia today, kinda something like the Gobi Desert. And also, as the last of the glaciers at the poles melted away, the sea levels would also continue to rise. The world was definitely in crisis, and as a result, life was struggling to bounce back from the most recent extinction. Those that were going to pull through and see their descendants inherit the world were going to have to be the toughest that they've ever been. As the continents above were experiencing such great unrest, beneath the waves, life was chugging along. The trilobites that had been hanging on for so long had been withered down to only a couple of different families. But they were about to be thrown a lifeline. In reaction to some of the creatures being wiped out in the previous extinction, the trilobites were about to explode in diversity for the first time since the Silurian. It finally seems like things were starting to look up. The other major niche that was left open from the mid-Permian extinction was the spot as an apex predator. And with the ammonites recovering and returning to their role, along with the bony fish, it was only a matter of time before some new sea monster came on the scene. At first, the lack of large macropredators would be filled by, of all things, a relic family of jawless vertebrates called the conodonts.
The top predators were jawless? Ha! This is rich. Remember when we had to flee the oceans because of all the... Ah! What the crap is that?
That would be the disturbing set of teeth that these lamprey-like creatures had in their sucker-shaped mouths. Although these animals have been around since the Cambrian, this time did see them expand and diversify. But I still wouldn't quite call them apex predators. That role would actually go to a much more familiar face. With the Eugeniodontids gone, it was finally time for the Hybodonts to spread back into the open ocean and become top predators. This is not exactly the same branch of the Chondrichthyans as modern sharks we know today, but they were a close cousin and likely filled a similar role. As some returned to the open water, others remained in the freshwater rivers to dominate there. And with that, it's time for us to come ashore again and see what's going on throughout Pangea. Normally, following a mass extinction, we see a dramatic rise in new organisms stepping up to fill the roles that were previously held by the ones that disappeared. Then new plants and animals become specialized to the current environment, and those would rule for as long as the new environmental conditions remained the same. The problem is, because of all this geologic upheaval, a lot of the conditions that caused the extinction at the middle of the Permian were still continuing for several million years after. And these conditions were not very hospitable for macro life in general. So, for about 10 million years following that event, biodiversity across the globe remained fairly low. But, as I said in the last episode, there were still some groups managing to hang on. One group of plants that got their start in the early Permian and would eke by on the arid global continent would be the cycads. And this would be enough to give some animals a chance. Despite early cycads being nutritionally poor, some herbivores were able to sustain themselves on this new type of plant. These would be the synapsids and diapsids that would survive in the late Permian deserts and coastal forests. Life, however, was a struggle, and the last of the dinocephalians were still able to claim their title of dominance for the moment. But their grip was slipping. One species that did well for a while was moss-chops, a species of Tapinocephalus whose rise appears to be linked to the rise of the first cycads. In response to this being the most readily food available, moss-chops became well adapted for consuming tough, hard-to-digest vegetation. So, kinda think of it as like the camel of its day. But it would start to see some competition from equally hardy creatures, like the diapsid parasaur Bradysaurus. The parasaurs as a whole quickly spread across Pangea and became the dominant group of large herbivores, eventually pushing the Tapinocephalids to the brink of extinction. And it's actually pretty interesting when you look at these creatures how similar these two very distinct families were. I guess no matter what clade they were a part of, being a squat, barrel-bodied animal with a short muzzle and peg-like teeth was the way to go in the latter half of the Permian. And, as these herbivores competed amongst each other, of course, new carnivores were going to follow suit, with another dinocephalian called a Tenosaurus. This was the monster of its time. If Titanophonius in the last episode was comparable to a tiger, then this thing was comparable to a bear. And it was the terror of any moss-chops or Bradysaurus that it encountered. But, even though it was the king of the desert, even it had some competition from other therapsids. And considering how shaky the hold these animals had on their environment was, it would be all too easy for the balance of power to tip once again. As we get into the late Permian around 260 million years ago, we see the last of many of the previously mentioned groups finally die off. The fact is that the middle Permian was just a really rough time to be alive, and many of the animals were barely making it as is. With such limited resources, the last thing that these animals needed was new competition. But new therapsids were adapting to this hellish world. And if there wasn't a place for them, they were going to push other creatures out of the way. They took all the qualities that made the therapsids unique and built on them. For instance, their specialized teeth. But ironically, one group of herbivorous therapsids called the Dicynodonts traded in their teeth for a beak that made them even better at eating through tough plants and roots than the Tapiocephalids. And this would be the key to their truly explosive success story. They started out small, with animals like Robertia, who still actually maintained two teeth, a set of tusks, theorized to be a case of sexual dimorphism since only some individuals within the same species had them. And in fact, some species of Dicynodonts wouldn't even share this dental arrangement at all. But the fact that their teeth were becoming so varied, both between different species and among the same species, was a sign of things to come. And as Pangea continued to dry out, this would give them the edge they needed to become the dominant group of herbivores across the world. This was a showcase of how life could eventually bounce back and, given enough time, will manage to adapt to nearly any environment. It took a while, but the animals of the Permian were managing to thrive. And it wasn't just the therapsids. The parasaurs were still going strong as well. But this was definitely the synapsids' time to shine. Besides the Dicynodonts, which exploded in diversity but remained smaller during this time, we have several different animals that started to take wildly different forms. One of the most noteworthy and interesting is a small creature that we call Suminia. This was a relative of another small burrower called Venucovia, who may have been getting outcompeted by the prairie dog lizards that were popping up all over the world. So this group of synapsids went in a completely different evolutionary direction. They became arboreal, trading in their more groundhog-shaped bodies for something that looks almost primate. Hence the name. These tiny herbivores got by because they started to feed where the Dicynodonts and parasaurs could not. And they evolved surprisingly dexterous hands to help climb and manipulate their environment. I wouldn't say it was quite on the same level as a monkey, probably more like a squirrel or a raccoon. But either way, very impressive for something that wouldn't even be considered a true mammal. And they weren't alone in the trees of the coastal forest either. Some, like the reptile Solorosaurus, not only could climb, but actually adapted to glide from tree to tree, in a similar way to the Draco lizards of today. Meaning that this was the first time that any known group of vertebrates evolved to take to the air in any capacity. This wouldn't be powered flight like what the insects of this time could do, but it was enough to avoid predators and navigate the trees. And that was definitely a necessity, because in place of the Dinocephalians, a new group of therapsid carnivores were going to experience the same wave of adaptive radiation as everything else living at this time. The descendants of the animals like Biarmasuchus. So you know what that means. It is time, Tim Tim. Time to take over the world. As we arrive at 252 million years ago, despite all the trials our planet has put our ancestors through, it seems that we were finally coming out on top. Life had finally bounced back on land, and in fact become even more diverse and widespread than ever before. The coastal forests of early ginkgos, cycads, and conifers were teeming with life. with fish and temnospondyls still in the rivers, insects and arachnids scurrying on the ground and flying in the skies, and various different reptiles and synapsids both browsing on the low brush and climbing among the trees. And as we leave the forest, that's when things would get really impressive. The Dicynodonts had evolved into several larger-bodied forms, like Vivaxosaurus, but another species was poised to take over the world in a way that had never been done before. The beaver-sized Lystrosaurus. But for the moment, they still were not the top herbivores. That role would still be controlled by the parasaurs, with the armor-plated species Scutosaurus. In addition to being heavily protected from attack, these reptiles were also well adapted for the vast interior deserts of Pangea. In other words, they were absolutely perfect for this hostile world. And with all these different animals spreading across the massive continent, there was ample opportunity for new predators to go on the hunt. Particularly, one group of carnivores who branched off from animals like Biarmasuchus, called the Theriodonts. This group really took off in the late Permian. It seems like just about every potential prey species had some member of this group specializing to hunt them. And they did this by splitting into 3 separate clades. The small, resourceful cynodonts, who would feed on all sorts of small creatures like invertebrates and small reptiles. In fact, many of them were actually omnivorous, like my new form, Divinia prima, which I love the name of. It makes me sound like a transformer god. And some even adapted more specialized niches like hunting in rivers, like Procynosuchus, which, despite having a name that suggests it's some kind of crocodile-like animal, I would say if anything it was more like an otter lizard. And when you put it like that, this is actually probably the best possible form for Tim.
This is great! The world is ours!
It really is. And I haven't even gotten into the most powerful predators yet. The next branch of the Theriodonts. The quick and nimble Theracephalians. Most of these predators were medium-sized, about like a wolf, and came in a variety of different species. Fast enough on the ground to run down most prey, and likely specialized for hunting things like Lystrosaurus. And it should be noted that small grooves on the pronounced canine teeth and what appears to be enlarged glands on the skull of some species suggest that there's a possibility that some of these hunters could have even packed a venomous bite. If this is the case, then this is among the earliest known terrestrial vertebrates that we have any solid evidence for being venomous, and it probably would have allowed them to take down much larger prey, as well as compete with the true kings of Permian Pangea, the Gorgonopsids. Like the other 2 clades of this group, there were several different species of Gorgonopsid. This clade was similar in shape to the Theracephalians, except everything was turned up to 11 with these guys. Instead of being the size of a wolf, these creatures were over 3 meters or 10 feet long, and weighed up to 300 kilograms or 660 pounds. And the pronounced canines that the Cynodonts and the Theracephalians had were even more so in the Gorgonopsids, forming the very first saber teeth, a dental arrangement that has been so effective that it would evolve at least half a dozen more times independently in the future. But these guys did it first. If the Cynodonts were the cunning, resourceful opportunists, and the Theracephalians were the venomous, agile assassins, then these things were the ultimate stem mammal apex predators. A bruiser that was a hunter of the biggest, most well-armored prey. And in fact, in the case of Inostrancevia, one of the largest members of this clade, was believed to actually have favored the armored Scutosaurus as prey. These animals struggled through the Permian, arguably the most challenging period that life has endured yet. And if you think about it, we had been the underdogs going all the way back to the Cambrian. Every time that we evolved, it was in response to a new threat that was claiming dominance. And by the end, it seemed like even the planet was working to make things more difficult. But now, the monsters that we feared were defeated. All because we learned to live with these conditions that nearly nothing else on Earth could. And now, we were never going to lose control of this planet again.
Yeah!
We would expand to every corner of the globe and never fall victim to the sauropsids or anything else.
Yeah!
And someday, we will learn to tame the very planet itself.
Yeah! What the hell was that?
What the hell was what?